Welcome to the show. And please tell me where you're watching this video. Leave your reply in the comments below. The most terrifying sound in modern warfare is not the scream of a missile, nor the roar of a jet engine. It is the hollow click of a firing pin striking an empty chamber. In September 2022, this was the cold, documented reality of Burkina Faso, a nation of 22 million people, besieged by a relentless insurgency, possessed fewer than 100 functional assault rifles in its strategic reserve. They were not an army. They were ghosts, sent to defend a graveyard against a monster that never sleeps. Do not turn away. This is more than a geopolitical update. It is the blueprint of a resurrection. Subscribe now to stand witness as history is rewritten. But from that abyss of silence, a thunderous transformation has occurred. In less than 3 years, a leadership that refused to kneel has taken a country from zero ammunition to the acquisition of heavy combat drones and the pursuit of nuclear energy. They replaced the begging bowl with the uranium rod. But how? How does a nation written off by the world as a failed state manage to finance a high-tech war and an industrial revolution while the world's banks slam their doors? To understand the miracle, we must first confront the rot. We must go back to the day the vault was opened, only to find it filled with nothing but dust. To understand the trajectory of Burkina Faso today, one must first measure the depth of the hole from which it is climbing. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré assumed command in September 2022, he did not inherit a functioning military machine. He inherited a ghost. Picture the scene inside the logistics command in Ouagadougou. Outside the gates, a nation was under siege. A relentless insurgency had already displaced millions, turning fertile villages into silent graveyards. But inside the armory, the silence was even more terrifying. For an entire army tasked with defending 22 million souls, the strategic reserve held fewer than 100 functional assault rifles, plus one. Let that number sink in. Fewer than 100 rifles. The ammunition count was equally chilling. Fewer than 100,000 rounds in the brutal calculus of modern combat. This is hardly enough to sustain a single day of high-intensity firefights across a jagged front line. The soldiers were not just outgunned. They were being sent into the abyss with empty hands. This is the starting point that history often forgets when it judges the pace of progress. It is easy to criticize the speed of a marathon runner when you do not see that he started the race barefoot on a road paved with broken glass. But the tragedy was not merely one of scarcity. It was one of paradox. While the Burkina Faso soldier counted his bullets with trembling hands, the skies above him were crowded with the most advanced technology in human history. For years, foreign partners, specifically French and American contingents, had maintained a robust military presence on Burkina Faso soil. Their satellites could reportedly read a license plate from space. Their drones could strike with surgical precision. Yet, miraculously, the insurgency only grew stronger. The soldiers on the ground lived a cruel irony. They would hear the roar of Allied jets overhead, engines screaming with power that cost more than their entire village's annual income. Yet, the intelligence gathered by these eyes in the sky often vanished into a diplomatic black hole. The ambush ahead would remain unflagged. The terrorists moved like the wind, invisible and unchecked, while the partners watched from their air-conditioned command centers. The conclusion drawn by the young leadership in Ouagadougou was stark and unavoidable. This was a maintained war. It was a conflict kept at a simmering temperature, hot enough to justify the continued presence of foreign intervention, but never cool enough to allow for true national independence. Traoré's administration faced a choice that would define the soul of the nation. They could continue to beg for aid, accepting the humiliation of foreign soldiers securing their cities while their own troops went without boots. They could continue to act as a proxy in someone else's geopolitical game. Or they could tear up the script. They chose the latter. The request for foreign forces to leave was not an act of blind, emotional nationalism. It was a cold, pragmatic calculation. The logic was simple. If you are not helping us end the war, you are in the way of those who will. The rusted lock of the past was shattered. The convoys packed up. The foreign flags came down. But as the dust settled on the departing trucks, a terrifying new reality set in. The door they had opened led to a vacuum. With the Western partners gone, the logistical void was absolute. The aid packages stopped. The credit lines froze. The intelligence feed went dark. Burkina Faso was now truly sovereign. But it was also truly alone. The army had to be rebuilt, not from the ground up, but from below the ground. They had reclaimed their dignity, but dignity does not stop a bullet. The enemy was regrouping, and the treasury was empty. How do you fight a 21st century war when the world's banks have blocked your account? Critics often point to an early promise made by Captain Traoré that 3 months would be enough to turn the tide. When the fighting continued past that deadline, cynics used the calendar as a weapon to dismantle his credibility. But context is the enemy of cynicism. When that statement was made, it was based on the assumption of a sovereign state, a state that could buy weapons, a state that had partners, a state that controlled its own destiny. The reality discovered in the days that followed was far darker. The delay was not a failure of strategy. It was the result of a systematic blockade. The captain revealed a truth that rarely makes it into the headlines of the international press. The money was there, but the permission was not. When the new administration attempted to purchase weapons to equip their depleting forces, they were met with a wall of diplomatic refusal. Traditional partners, those who had maintained military bases on Burkina soil for decades, reportedly refused to sell lethal equipment. They offered training, they offered advice, they offered support, but they would not offer the tools necessary to pull the trigger. It became clear that the war was being managed, not fought. Traoré's administration understood that renting security is a fatal error. You cannot rent the roof over your head if you want to keep your children dry. You must own it, and to own it, you must pay. This is a crucial detail of modern sovereignty. True independence is not just about flying a flag. It is about the ability to transact. When you are cut off from the global credit lines for defense, you must pay in cash. And to pay in cash, you must have an economy that works for the state, not for foreign corporations. We saw the government pivot with aggressive speed. They turned to new partners, nations willing to sell without political conditions. They looked to Turkey, to Russia, to North Korea, not for ideology, but for survival. They needed Kalashnikovs, not lectures on governance. They needed artillery, not seminars on soft power. And slowly, the shelves began to fill. The silence of the armory was replaced by the heavy industrial sound of crates being pried open. But equipment is only metal until it is placed in human hands. The psychological shift was perhaps more critical than the physical one. For decades, the Burkina soldier had been trained to believe that he was inferior. Implicitly and explicitly, he was told he needed a foreign officer to guide him, a foreign satellite to tell him where the enemy was hiding. The psychological chains of colonialism are often stronger than the economic ones. The mental decolonization that Captain Traoré speaks of is not abstract philosophy. It is military doctrine. It is the belief that a Burkina officer can read a map, plan an operation, and execute a strike better than any advisor who will fly home when the situation gets too dangerous. This is the foundation of the war for independence. It is not merely a counterterrorism operation. It is a struggle to prove that an African nation can secure itself. The soil must be tilled by local hands if the harvest is to belong to the people. If you rely on your neighbor to water your garden, you should not be surprised when he takes the fruit. By late 2024, the narrative had shifted. The army was no longer a ghost. It was growing, recruiting 10 to 15,000 men annually. The 3-month promise was missed, yes, but in its place, a 3-decade-long dependency was broken. The critics focus on the calendar. The patriots focus on the capability. However, rifles and courage are ground-level assets. To win this war, courage was not enough. War is the most expensive endeavor a nation can undertake. A single missile for a heavy drone costs more than a school. A battalion consumes tons of food and fuel every week. The Western banks have closed their doors. The aid packages have been cut. The credit ratings have been slashed. So, a terrifying question looms over every airstrike and every new battalion. Where does the money come from? How does a nation, supposedly one of the poorest in the world, finance a high-tech war without driving its people into starvation? The answer lies beneath the feet of the soldiers. For decades, Burkina Faso has been sitting on a fortune, but the keys to the vault were held in London, Paris, and Toronto. To sustain the shield, the government realized they had to seize the shovel. The war for security was about to become a war for gold. There is a fundamental truth that governs the fate of nations. He who feeds you controls you, but he who holds the keys to your vault owns you. For 60 years, the relationship between this land and its natural resources was one of cruel paradox. The land was rich, yet the people were poor. The gold bars were flown to Switzerland and Canada, while the holes in the ground were left to the villages. The state was merely a tax collector, happy to receive a meager 10% royalty, while 90% of the wealth vanished across the ocean. To finance a war of survival without begging for loans, this equation had to be shattered. The administration realized that sovereignty is not just about the flag flying over the palace. It is about the gold sleeping beneath the rock. In a move that sent shockwaves through the mining boardrooms of the West, the government stopped asking for a larger share and started buying the table. The acquisition of the Boungou and Wahgnion mines from the British firm Endeavour Mining was the turning point. This was not nationalization in the old, chaotic sense of seizing assets by decree. It was a strategic commercial purchase. The state put down nearly $80 million, 60 million of it in hard cash, to take back control. Critics asked, where did a country at war find $80 million? The answer was uncomfortable for the old political elite. The money was always there. It was simply being drained by a system of leakage, corruption, and mismanagement. By tightening the screws on public finance and clearing the debts of state-owned enterprises, the funds appeared. This was a message to the world. Burkina Faso is no longer a passive landlord. It is an active operator. The gold that comes out of the soil will now pay for the drones that protect the sky. This economic philosophy extends beyond the mines. It reaches into the very administration of the state. The introduction of aggressive digitalization was not about modernizing for the sake of aesthetics. It was a weapon against corruption. When you digitize the tax system, when you remove physical cash from the hands of the bureaucrat, you remove the opportunity for the bribe. Resistance was fierce. The old guard, accustomed to envelopes and deals made in dark corners, fought back with inertia and sabotage. But the direction was set. Electronic invoicing is now becoming the standard, forcing a transparency that the business elite in Ouagadougou had avoided for decades. This is the core of the vision laid out by the leadership, that political freedom is a hallucination without economic control. They understand that a soldier cannot fight on an empty stomach, and a nation cannot stand tall if its knees are buckling under the weight of imported debt. But success breeds envy, and autonomy breeds fear in those who benefit from dependency. As the economy began to stabilize, the geopolitical temperature in the region began to rise. When a country decides to break the chains of the past, it does not just liberate itself. It threatens the status quo of its neighbors. The walls began to close in. Borders were tightened. Diplomatic channels went cold. And then, whispers began to emerge of a darker betrayal, one that would force the country to look for allies in the most unexpected places. The encirclement that the leadership speaks of is not paranoia. It is a map. When a country decides to break the chains of the past, it does not just liberate itself. It threatens the status quo of its neighbors. The example is dangerous. If Burkina Faso succeeds, what questions will the youth of neighboring countries start to ask their own leaders? Why are we still poor? Why are we still dependent? Why are foreign soldiers still on our soil? To prevent these questions from being asked, the example must be crushed. The focus shifts now to the south, to the long border with the Ivory Coast, where the diplomatic freeze is turning into a Cold War. If you look at a map of West Africa, you will see that Burkina Faso is landlocked. But in the eyes of its current leadership, it is not just landlocked. It is encircled. The most dangerous frontier is no longer the arid north where the terrorists roam, but the lush south where a diplomatic ice age has set in. The relationship with the Ivory Coast, once a brotherly bond forged by history and migration, has fractured into open suspicion. The accusation is harsh, that neighboring territories have become rear bases for the destabilization of the Sahel. The logic is military, not political. When insurgents strike in Burkina Faso and then vanish across the southern border to rest and rearm, the border ceases to be a line on a map. It becomes a sanctuary for the enemy. This divergence paved the way for the collapse of ECOWAS in the hearts of the Sahelian people. The regional bloc, intended to be a vehicle for economic integration, was perceived by the new juntas not as a shield, but as a sword. When the sanctions hit, stopping medicine and fuel from reaching the people, the emotional bond was severed. From the ashes of this broken trust, the Alliance of Sahel States AS was born. This is not a paper tiger. It is a confederation forged in the fire of necessity. Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso have realized that their survival depends on their unity. They share the same threat, the same terrain, and now, the same enemy. At the center of this geopolitical storm stands Captain Ibrahim Traoré, who has become the architect of a bloc that refuses to be a doormat for foreign powers. Along with his counterparts in Bamako and Niamey, he is building a joint force and envisioning a future where they trade, bank, and develop together, independent of the coastal powers that turn their backs on them. The reaction from the West has been a mixture of condemnation and quiet alarm. The United States and France watch as their influence evaporates, replaced by a vacuum that is quickly being filled by a new defiant Pan-Africanism. But military alliances and political rhetoric are not enough to build a future. You can have the strongest army in the region, but a sovereign nation cannot run on diesel generators and charcoal. It needs industrial power. It needs a heartbeat that never flickers. To industrialize, to process the gold, to run the factories, and to light up the schools, you need baseload power. And to get it, Burkina Faso is about to make a leap that terrified the world. A sovereign nation cannot run on diesel generators and charcoal. It needs industrial power. For decades, the energy policy of Burkina Faso was one of scarcity, patchy grids, frequent blackouts, and a reliance on imported fuel. But to industrialize, to process the gold, to run the factories, and to light up the schools, you need baseload power that never flickers. In a geopolitical leap that stunned the West, the leadership did not turn to solar panels from Europe. They turned to nuclear power from Russia. The agreement with Rosatom to construct a nuclear power plant is perhaps the most ambitious project in the country's history. This is not a vague promise. The roadmap has been drawn with concrete precision. From the initial Memorandum of Understanding in October 2023 to the strategic roadmap signed in Sochi in March 2024, and finally, the agreements on training and infrastructure solidified in St. Petersburg in June 2024. Critics call it a fantasy. They ask how a developing nation, currently fighting a war, can manage the complexity of nuclear fission. But the administration sees it differently. They see it as the only path from darkness to light. They are sending students to Moscow, not to learn poetry, but to learn atomic physics. They are preparing a generation of engineers who will manage a grid powered by the atom. This is the long game. It is a refusal to accept that Africans should only have appropriate technology, often a code word for low-tech solutions that keep them poor. Traore is demanding the highest technology available. This decision is the clearest signal yet that the country is pivoting east. The partnership with Russia, Iran, and Turkey is not about swapping one master for another, as detractors claim. It is about diversification. It is about having options. When you have only one bread seller, he sets the price. When you have 5, you decide what to pay. This is the ultimate test of sovereignty, proving that a small nation can navigate the storm of great power competition without sinking. However, the road to this nuclear future is long, and the threats of the present are immediate. The encirclement is real. The economic war is brutal, and the internal enemies, the valets of imperialism, as the captain calls them, are still waiting for a moment of weakness. The revolution has survived its infancy. But can it survive its adolescence? To do so, it must become something rare, something paradoxical, something the world has never seen before. Ibrahim Traoré has used a cryptic metaphor to describe this emerging reality: the black albino. It is an image of something rare, something paradoxical, something that defies the expected genetic code of history. It suggests that what is being built here is not just a new government, but a new type of African state, entirely one that does not fit the molds cast in Paris or Washington. The experts predicted that without French support, Burkina Faso would collapse in weeks. They predicted that leaving ECOWAS would lead to economic ruin. They predicted that challenging the mining giants would lead to bankruptcy. Yet, here stands the anomaly. The black albino is the African state that survives against the odds. It is the economy that grows despite sanctions. It is the army that advances despite embargoes. It is the living proof that the standard model of post-colonial governance was not the only option. It was just the only option we were allowed to see. The road ahead is still paved with jagged stones. The war is not over. The terrorists still lurk in the bush, waiting for a moment of complacency. The economic transition will have days of hardship, where the shelves might flicker with scarcity before they fill with local abundance. But the trajectory has changed. The compass has been reset. As we look at the horizon of 2026, we see a nation that is no longer on its knees. It is a nation of calloused hands and steady eyes. The soil is being turned. The seed is being planted. And though the harvest is not yet fully gathered, the promise of it hangs heavy in the air. This is not just the story of a captain or a hunter. It is the story of a people reclaiming their name. They are no longer the subjects of an empire, nor the recipients of aid. They are the architects of their own survival. From the empty armories to the nuclear agreements, from the dusty trenches to the drone-filled skies, the message from Burkina Faso is clear. The night was long, but the dawn belongs to those who refuse to sleep. If this story resonates with your sense of justice, do not leave. Subscribe to Stand with the Story, and share this video to wake another mind.